What happens if you take a spooky diorama and shrink it? Stick around to find out. Hello and welcome to Little Giant Crafts. So I've got a fun one today, but I really don't have much preamble, so let's just get into it. One of my favorite movies is a cheesy horror movie from the 80s called Waxwork. The movie's about a man who comes into town and builds a wax museum featuring 18 exhibits based on the most evil beings from throughout history. Granted, the term history is a little fast and loose here, but we'll go with it. Basically, all the stereotypical movie monsters. Mummy, Dracula, Frankenstein, zombies, you name it. So what happens is these teens go into the museum, and of course, it's supernatural, and the exhibits act as a portal to each creature's world. So the kid that gets pushed into the werewolf exhibit gets transported to a werewolf movie. It's a really fun premise, and like I said, it's a cheesy movie, but I watched it a ton growing up, so I have a huge fondness for it. And I thought it would be a great idea for crafting to make each individual little exhibit. So that's what we're gonna do.
You into a new dimension in terror. Waxwork.
Now, full disclosure, I started this project quite a while ago, before I even started the YouTube channel, so I've actually made 2 of these already that I did not film, but I thought it's October, it's a perfect spooky Halloween craft, so I thought I would make another one and go through my process. Now, initially, very briefly, I thought about making them faithfully to how they are in the movie, but I very quickly pivoted and decided to do sort of little modular boxes that could be, rearranged and displayed in any order. And that way I could also go beyond the movie and make displays for, anything, and it would all fit in. So I decided I'll make a very simple box. Since they're going to be, in a row next to each other, I don't want them to completely block each other. So I decided instead of an open-faced cube, I am going to basically cut the angles off the front walls just so you can, see a little more into each display. But it's pretty simple. I'm going to do 4 sheets of cardboard, and then, each different monster or whatever will go in there. And then to really tie it all together, each exhibit is going to be blocked off by velvet rope. The other thing I decided is that I want 2 sizes. One will be for, small exhibits for single figures, but I also wanted to make a double-sized exhibit, either for larger creatures or multiple figures, and we'll actually see one in the end of the video. This also has the added benefit of, if I'm doing 2 rows of these displays back to back, the double length exhibit can also serve as a bookend, sort of. So, it's just more variety. But it's a pretty simple build, so let's get into it. So I started out really simple, cutting the walls and floors out of chipboard, and I'll throw the dimensions on screen. And also, I did not do this originally, but it occurred to me that I could cut the entire thing out of a single sheet and then fold it up, which would make gluing it together a lot easier. So, handy tip. And then since I really want to lean into the exhibit feeling, I'm going to have a raised floor. So I put a piece of foam board down on the inside. Now the one I'm making for this video is basically the figure is a vampire, but it's inspired by the Jack the Ripper exhibit in the film. So I'm going for sort of a Victorian alleyway with a street lamp. So I've got the figure I'm going to use and a street lamp I 3D printed, and first order of business is to figure out the layout of the exhibit, where everything's going to go, and then cut out a hole for where the figure will go. Sometimes I get ahead of myself and I actually glued the foam board down before I realized that I wanted to cut a hole out for the figure so it would fit into the floor and not on top of it. But it was still easy enough to, cut a circle and rip the foam out. Now for the other two displays, which again you'll see at the end, I painted the walls like a mural, but for this one I decided I wanted to be a little more three-dimensional. So instead of having the walls of this building be the walls of the exhibit, I decided to sort of put them at an angle sticking out so the walls are actually part of the exhibit. So I decide where I'm going to put those, and then I cut out some pieces of foam. And since they're going to be at an angle, I also cut the edges of the foam, so that way they lie flat against the chipboard. And then, as I've done in other videos, I draw a brick pattern into them because they're going to be simple brick buildings. On the bigger wall, it's going to be the front of a house, so I leave space for a door and window, and then I cut out the foam to put in the door. After I cut out the door from the foam, I glue a piece of cardboard on back, and then with a thin piece of cardboard, I draw the door and I cut out the 4 rectangles, and then I glue that onto the other piece of cardboard so that way there's a little dimension to it and it has that door design. And then I forget to do this until later on, but I just glue on a small random bit to serve as a doorknob. I also take some pieces of coffee stir stick and I cut out a window frame and just glue that on. The thing I really like about making these as exhibits is that they can sort of be intentionally artificial. So for example, I'm not cutting out the window the same way I did with the door. Normally, if I were building a piece of terrain, I would cut out the window and then use, say, clear plastic packaging. But for this, in my mind, they are basically like building a set for a play. They're not really putting in a window. They're just gonna, glue a frame onto the wall and paint it. So it can intentionally be less realistic. So in a few spots like that, that's sort of what I'm aiming for, or at least I'm not worrying about realism constantly. And then I just add a few more little details, like I cut up some cardboard to make an arch over the door. I use some little silica gel beads as lights, but that's pretty much it for the building. I am still going to paint some of the walls as a backdrop, so I decide I want to try and play around with perspective. So I put the walls in place and mark where the bricks end, and then I draw the bricks going towards a vanishing point, which it'll be more clear later, but it, to look like the house goes further into the distance than it really does, and the same for the wall on the left side. And then the last thing before painting, well, not really last, but I'm going to show it last. Part of the reason I put off finishing this project for quite a while, even though the other two exhibits were like 95% done, I wasn't sure how to connect these. I didn't just want to put them down and let them sit there because, if you bump into the table or, they can move around. So my first idea was basically I 3D printed clips that were just wide enough to hold 2 pieces of chipboard. They would basically hold together the walls of each cube, but I really wasn't happy with it and I couldn't think of a good idea until finally coming back to this project. It occurred to me, and I don't know why I didn't think about this sooner, but magnets. For one thing, I magnetize all my miniatures because I keep them on metal shelves. So that meant I could cut a small square of tin from a can and glue it onto the base, so that way they would stay in the diorama when you're moving it around. But what occurred to me is that I could do the same thing for the outside. Now, initially I was concerned that I would have to be very careful and pay attention to the polarities of the magnets so that they would stick to each other, but it soon occurred to me I wouldn't have to do that if I alternated between magnets and pieces of metal, so I'll put up a diagram to better explain what I mean. But basically, this ensures that each side of each exhibit can connect to every other side of every other exhibit, which is great for modularity because it just gives you a ton of options. But I made a little frame that I can put over each side of the exhibit, so I can glue the magnets and the pieces of metal in the exact same spot on each one, and that will make sure they all line up. So, having said all that, this is pretty much ready for painting. The painting is also going to be pretty simple. First off, I do a light gray for the ground. I was thinking about carving cobblestone into the foam, but in the movie, it's like just a flat, maybe even concrete floor. So I decided to keep it simple and stick with that. I paint the outside walls black because they're, not an important part of the exhibit, but I don't want to leave them plain cardboard. And then I start base coating the walls, which are mostly red from brick. And then I throw in a few brown bricks just to give some variation. So then I decide it is time to start working on the backgrounds. I had done a rough sketch earlier, but now I go in with a ruler and draw all the lines. And then I draw them in pen, thinking that it will be dark enough that it'll show through and not get covered by the paint, and it actually worked out pretty well. I won't go into perspective drawing here. I'm sure you can find a ton of tutorials if you're interested, but the basics of it are pretty simple. The only real problem I had is that, the only problem in general is that the perspectives only work from certain angles. So if you're not looking at that angle, the background kind of ended up looking a little wonky, but overall I'm still pretty happy with it. And then, I just paint over the lines with red to match the rest of the bricks. Also at this point, I decided that I wanted to cover up the ground with a piece of cardboard because I had traced in the footprint of where the walls were going to go, so I wouldn't, waste painting a spot that's going to get covered up. But I was imprecise, so I realized that where the walls were going to go, the tracing I did went outside of that, and it was pretty noticeable. So I just decided to cover it with a piece of cardboard after measuring and making sure I had the circle cut out in the same spot so it would still line up. But once I did that, I just repainted it in gray and kept going. Also, I did what I usually forget to do, which is paint things before you glue them into spots that would be difficult to reach. Once the base coats are done, I also do some, brown on the doors, and then I just do some very simple highlights on like the stone arches above the door and the window frames. Very simple, nothing too crazy. You could, do weathering and a wash and all that, but I want these to be quicker builds, and I did this whole thing in about 2 days, which is a lot faster than my usual crafting pace. But once I'm done painting the walls, I glue them in, and then I cut out some pieces of chipboard to cover up the holes in the exhibit. And then the last two things I do end up using some weathering powders. I add a little gray to the brick wall just to tone down the color a bit, but then I take my black weathering powder because I was not entirely happy with how the wall background looked. So I put the black on the furthest part of the wall, which makes it look like it's going off into shadow, and it really made the three-dimensional effect more convincing, and I was really happy with that. Then I paint the outside in a gloss black just because I like that finish more for the outside. And then once that's done, the very last thing to do, just very simple silver and red, paint the velvet ropes, and it's done. I'm gonna be honest, going to the result, I don't have a little vignette story like usual because every single one would be, oh no, the exhibit came to life. And I plan on doing more of these in the future, so I figure for these little ones, I won't bother. But I will show you this one and the other two that I finished previous. Enjoy! So yeah, I'm really happy with this idea. They were pretty easy to build, especially for someone like me who is a very slow builder. I'm really looking forward to building more of these over time and just having like a huge display of them. I really want to get like a big sheet of metal, maybe like something made for wall hanging, and display them vertically. Heck, even put them on a refrigerator. Like, there's just something really cool about like stacking them to me. Plus, since crafting sort of takes up a lot of space, it's nice to have something that doesn't just, take up a lot of floor space. I could hang them vertically and, take up less room that way. But overall, I really love them and I look forward to doing more in the future. I hope you had fun. If so, please consider liking and subscribing if you're not already a subscriber. If you really like what we're doing and want to support us, you can check out the links below to support us on Patreon. A huge thank you to all our current patrons. You can also check out the links below if you want to see what else we're working on. But until next time, be creative, be kind, and take care of yourself. I've been Jesse. I don't think I ever really say that, but why not?
Maybe a shocked face.
I refuse. I don't know. One of those will be good.